Naples and Mount Vesuvius by Frank G. Carpenter. Travel Collection 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Naples and Mount Vesuvius. The Italians have a saying, "See Naples and die," for they say you will then have seen the most beautiful city of the world. And indeed it is beautiful. The sky is almost always bright, and it is nowhere brighter than at Naples. The Mediterranean is almost always blue, and at the Bay of Naples its color is glorious. The city, as it rises about the bay, tier above tier, seems a city of palaces. There are hazy blue mountains behind it, and south of it is the great brown volcano Vesuvius, with its steaming cones standing out against the blue sky. But let us see how it looks in the city itself. We leave our hotel and climb up through the streets. Many of them are steep, and we are always going up or down hill. The high buildings are close to the sidewalks, and the streets are so narrow that in places the walls shut out the sun. They are not over clean, and in some streets the smells are offensive. The people live in flats or apartments, and in the poorer quarters of the city whole families dwell in one room. What curious things the people do on the streets! We see men and women sitting down on the pavements making their toilets. There is a woman combing her hair, and here is one washing her baby. There is a cobbler at his bench soling a pair of old shoes, and beside him a tailor is working away. What a lot of children there are everywhere! There are two babies sprawling on the edge of the gutter. Here comes a boy of 8 driving a donkey, and there is another with a can in his hand pulling along 2 milk goats from door to door. He is one of the little milkmen of the city, and is probably helping his father, whom we see with those goats farther on. There are donkeys carrying all sorts of things. Here comes one loaded with fruit, and behind are 2 others ridden by boys. The donkeys are not bigger than Newfoundland dogs, and their ears are almost as long as their legs. Many of the Neapolitan boys have their own donkeys, as our boys sometimes have ponies. Do you like roasted chestnuts? There are men selling them here on almost every block. They have little furnaces and basins of charcoal on which they roast chestnuts out in the streets. We pass fruit stands every now and then, and buy delicious pears for 10 cents a dozen, and oranges too for a cent. See the crowd of men and women about that cook stand? They are buying roast sausages and stewed macaroni. Italy is famous for its macaroni, and quantities of it are exported to our country every year. See, there is a man eating some now. He twists his fork around and around in the dish and takes a great mass of it at one gulp. He does not cut it, but sucks in the long strings until the whole has gone down his throat. Suppose we visit one of the factories and learn how macaroni is made. Such factories are to be seen in all parts of Italy, for macaroni forms a large part of the food of the people. It is made in different sizes and shapes, sometimes in long strings, sometimes in pipes as big around as your finger, and sometimes in sticks about as thick as a knitting needle. The finer kinds are called vermicelli and spaghetti. We see the tubes of white dough drying on the racks in front of the factory, and when we go in find a score of men and boys hard at work. Each boy is so covered with flour that his dark rosy face looks almost ghastly in contrast with his sparkling black eyes. He is in his bare feet, and his sleeves are rolled up to his shoulders. The men are mixing the flour into dough and kneading it with great bars so fastened to hinges that they can press the dough down on the table. After it is thoroughly kneaded, they carry it to a cylinder in which there are many small holes, so arranged that it can be pressed through them. It comes out in long pipes or sticks, which the boys carry to the racks in the sun, or to the hot drying rooms which some factories have for the purpose. Let us stroll on down to the bay. It is filled with shipping, for Naples is the chief port of the Italian peninsula, and its harbor is one of the finest of Europe. The city is as big as St. Louis, and has a vast trade with all parts of the Mediterranean, with northern Europe, and with North and South America. It also does a great business in fish and in coral and sponges. It has many fishing vessels, and its people go fishing not only in the Mediterranean, but out to the Atlantic and elsewhere. But the most interesting thing about Naples is not in the city itself. It is the great volcano outside, only a short drive away. Vesuvius is the only active volcano on the continent of Europe, and it is one of the most interesting volcanoes of the whole world. It is early morning when we start out to explore it. The first part of our journey is in a carriage driven by a Neapolitan coachman, who cracks his whip every minute and keeps his team on the gallop. We rattle out of the city over pavements of lava, now almost running over a baby, and now making the dogs howl as with drooping tails they leap out of our way. We go through small villages of lava-built houses, by vineyards and gardens walled with lava, and then up through foothills of volcanic sand until we enter a region which is all bare brown lava. There is lava everywhere and in all sorts of shapes. We pass through seas and rivers of lava which once flowed like fire, but which now are cold and dead, and as we look up, see a column of steam hanging like a gigantic umbrella over a brown lava mountain, the volcano of Vesuvius. The mountain is perfectly bare. There is not a bit of grass to be seen anywhere. It is all lava, ashes, and volcanic sand. The road going up winds in and out until it at last becomes so steep that we must leave the carriages and mount donkeys. When about 2,000 feet above the sea, we reach the observatory, where instruments are kept to register the movements of the mighty volcano. How the earth rumbles! It was shaking as we rode up on our donkeys, and here by the instruments we can see just what motion is going on away down in the heart of the mountain. The director of the observatory informs us that Vesuvius is always more or less active, but that there is no present danger. He describes the first recorded eruption, telling us how a little more than 1,800 years ago the volcano was covered with farms, the slopes being cultivated almost to the top. Then there were vineyards all over the land where the lava and ashes now are, and hot springs on the edge of the mountains, where the rich Romans came for their health and for sport. There were beautiful towns on the plains near by, and, among others, the two fashionable resorts of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Pompeii contained about 25,000 people. It was a rich residence city, and its inhabitants had beautiful homes, temples, and theaters. The rich were living in fine style, giving parties and dinners, and driving about in their chariots with gay prancing horses. The poor were at work at their trades. The merchants were selling goods in the stores, the children were going to school, and all sorts of business were being carried on, when one day, without warning, the great mountain burst forth, sending vast volumes of steam, ashes, burning rocks, and mud high into the air. There were so many ashes that they darkened the sun and turned the day into night. Even at Rome, hundreds of miles to the northward, the sun was hidden. The people thought that the end of the world had come, and that an age when it would be always night had set in. At the same time it rained mud, and rivers of boiling hot mud flowed out of the crater down over the plain. The horses, sheep, and cattle which were pasturing there were drowned. The fields, the vineyards, and gardens were covered, and in the towns even the tallest buildings were soon buried. They all disappeared, and the region became a great plain of ashes and mud. As time went on, new towns grew up on the plains, and crops of all kinds were raised there. The buried cities were blotted out of the memory of man, as the volcano had blotted them from the face of the earth. So it remained until a little more than 150 years ago, when a peasant who was digging a well struck his spade against a statue. He dug it out, and soon it was found that there was a city down there, buried under the earth. The government of Italy took possession of the place, and for years it has had men at work unearthing the city. The scholars began to investigate the history of the region, and it was found that the site of the lost city of Pompeii had been discovered. The great eruption occurred in the latter part of the first century of our era, and for a long time thereafter the volcano lay quiet. During the 18th century there was another terrible eruption, and in 1822 the whole top of the mountain burst off and formed a great chasm 3 miles in circumference and about half a mile deep. Since then other eruptions have caused streams of lava to flow out of the crater, until now Vesuvius seems to be only a vast mass of lava, rock, sand, and ashes. Leaving the observatory, we again mount our donkeys and make our way up the mountain. At last we reach the station from where we are to ride up to the crater by rail. The railroad is a little like the one up Pikes Peak, but more like one of our cable car lines. The track has three rails, one in the center which supports the weight of the car, and others at each side for the guiding wheels which keep the car from jumping the track. The cable attached to the car runs around a wheel at the top of the mountain and is moved by an engine at the station below. The sides of the car are open and we get a magnificent view of the Mediterranean as we rise through the volcanic sand up the steep mountain. We go rapidly upward and at last we stop near the crater, over 4,000 feet above the sea. Here we hire other guides and pick our way over the thin coating of lava to the mouth of the volcano. The air is hot and full of sulfur fumes. We cough and hold our handkerchiefs to our faces in a vain effort to keep out the fumes. The wind is blowing the steam away from the crater, and we walk carefully over the crust and look down into a vast pit walled with yellow sulfur, in the bottom of which a lake of fire is seething, sending up steam, ashes, brimstone, and rocks. Now it seems to be quiet, and now it bursts forth, throwing stones high up into the air. They fall back, and we can hear them splash away down in the crater. But now the wind changes. It is rising into a gale, and the stones are falling almost at our feet. Our guides drag us back and hurry us away, for fear we may all be killed by the burning hot stones. This is only a gentle eruption. When the great outbursts occur, the noise is like that of a battle, and rocks weighing many tons are shot upwards for hundreds of feet. About 50 years ago, 20 sightseers were killed where we now stand by a sudden eruption of lava, pieces of rock being thrown a mile high. At such times the steam rises to a height of more than 2 miles, and the whole mountain is covered by an umbrella of ashes and vapor more than 5 miles in height. How warm the earth is! We dare not stand still. We seem to be walking upon a hot stove. We smell our shoes burning. We bend down and touch the lava with our fingers, but draw them away quickly, smarting with the heat. One of the guides asks us to look at the cracks in the earth, and we see golden streams of molten lava flowing through them under our feet. He thrusts an iron rod into one of the cracks and brings out a lump of the red-hot metal. He asks us for a penny, and he presses it into the mass with a stick. He then drops the lava off the rod into a bucket of water which a boy has brought up. The water hisses and steams, but the lava soon cools and the guide takes it out. Our penny is now embedded in the lava like a raisin in a bun, and we take it home as a relic. But see, the boy is pulling some eggs out of his pocket. He points to the water and offers to cook them for us. He rests the bucket over a wide crack where the molten lava is not far from the surface. The intense heat soon boils the water, and the eggs are cooked hard. We carry them back with us down the mountain and eat them with our lunch at the railroad station below, priding ourselves that we are among the few Americans who have eaten eggs cooked on volcanoes. We then ride back to the carriages and drive over the plain to the site of the once buried city of Pompeii. There is a great wall about it made of the ashes and stones which have been already dug out, and we find many boys and men digging and carrying the stuff out in baskets on their backs and their heads. A large part of Pompeii is already uncovered, and we walk through streets walled with the curious buildings which were blotted out by Vesuvius 1800 years ago. The earth and ashes have so preserved the buildings that they look today almost as they did at the time of the eruption. The roadways are paved with stone, and in some of them we can see the ruts made by the wheels of the chariots. We walk through the amphitheater where the people had their shows, and sit down on the marble seats of the bathhouses where the boys of Pompeii sat when they had finished their baths centuries ago. We wander about through the houses, peopling them with their old Roman owners. Many buildings are of brick and many of stone. They are nearly all of 1 or 2 stories and some are very large. They had wooden roofs which were burned off by the ashes. Many of the houses have walls covered with paintings, and in some beautiful statues in bronze and marble were found. Some had fine paintings and all sorts of beautiful things in metals and carvings. The floors of many were formed of different colored stones, fitted together in mosaic pictures, and the Latin word salve, or welcome, was carved over their doors, while in one entrance floor there was a mosaic picture of a fierce dog gnashing his teeth and tugging at a rope as though he wished to get at you, while at his feet were the words Cave Canem, or beware of the dog. We are interested in the business parts of Pompeii, where there are streets of shops with marble counters where the merchants were selling their goods when the mighty volcanic flood came. We peep into a public bake oven in which black loaves of burnt bread were found when the mud and ashes were first dug away. We see casts of men, women, and children, and even of dogs, made by pouring plaster of Paris into the holes which their bodies formed in the ashes. And when we again visit the Museum of Naples, we are shown cooking utensils, toilet articles, rings, earrings, and bracelets, fish hooks and knives, and thousands of other articles of every description, all in common use among these people when, without warning, they were destroyed by the ashes and boiling mud of the terrible mountain. End of Naples and Mount Vesuvius.
Beware. Wood's Illustrated Handbook to New York. Travel Collection Number 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beware, on approaching and coming into the city, of the good-natured civilities of persons you have never seen before. Gratuitous offers of assistance or advice or good fellowship are suspicious, to say the least. Do not be persuaded to go anywhere with these casual acquaintances. If you are an utter stranger, you will find the handbook, your best and most trustworthy friend, will not mislead you. While it is not necessary to particularize every place in the metropolis that is respectable as a stopping place, or as a resort for amusement, it leaves unmentioned such as are in the least doubtful and which ought to be avoided. Some which are notorious and extremely insidious are briefly specified under this heading, while the newspapers give daily accounts of the innumerable ways of entrapping strangers in the city. Beware. If you are at a loss in the street of accosting anyone but a policeman, him you will know by his uniform, blue coat and cap and brass buttons. If you do not see a policeman, step into the nearest store or hotel and make your inquiries. Beware of the purlieus of the city. They are only to be visited under the escort of a police officer. Beware of mock auctions in stores and of the pleasant-faced man who invites you to look in. Beware of panel houses. A sliding panel is let into the walls of some doubtful houses, through which thieves enter unperceived and have you at their mercy. Beware of saloons with pretty waiter girls. They are among the most dangerous decoys in the city. Beware of all who accost you in the street, particularly if they want your advice about a pocketbook they have just found, or a roll of money which they have picked up. Such persons have a very innocent and inexperienced air. Distrust them. Don't stop to listen to them. Beware of visiting a fashionable gambling house just to see what is going on. Beware of giving street beggars or organ grinders more than a few pennies. Beware of walking late in the evening, except in the busiest thoroughfares of the city. Beware of exposing your watch, pocketbook, or jewelry in the streets, lecture rooms, theaters, or in omnibuses or cars. You should suspect anyone, man or woman, well or ill-dressed, who crowds or presses against you, The contents of your pockets are in danger. Ladies, keep your pocketbooks in the bosom of your dress. Beware of hack drivers' extortions. Beware of passing under a building in course of erection or repairs. It is worth while to cross the street twice to avoid it. Beware, especially in the evening, of persons who ask you what time it is. They have designs on your watch. Beware of leaving any considerable sum of money or any valuables in your trunk, or of carrying them on your person. There is a safe in every hotel where you can deposit such things without charge. Beware of talking about your business before strangers. Beware of even the orderly dance houses. A sadder story of New York life cannot be written than that connected with these places. End of Beware.
Crater Lake, one of the world's great natural wonders, by W. G. Steele. Travel Collection 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Crater Lake, one of the world's great natural wonders. A trip to Crater Lake is, to a lover of the grand and beautiful in nature, an important event, around which will ever cluster memories of unalloyed happiness, thoughts of little adventures and weird experiences that go to make life worth living. It is situated in the northwest portion of Klamath County, Oregon, 22 miles west of north of Fort Klamath and about 80 miles northeast of Medford, which is the best point to leave the Oregon and California Railroad. The Jacksonville and Fort Klamath Military Road passes the lake within 3 miles, and the road to the very walls of it is an exceptionally good one for the mountainous country, while in near proximity may be found remarkably fine camping grounds. The Indians of southern Oregon have known of it for ages, but until recently none have seen it, for the reason that a tradition, handed down from generation to generation, described it as the home of myriads of sea devils, or, as they were called, leos, and it was considered certain death for any brave even to look upon it. This superstition still haunts the Klamaths. While a few of the tribe have visited it, they do so with a sort of mysterious dread of the consequences. It was discovered by a party of 12 prospectors on June 12, 1853, among whom were J. W. Hillman, George Ross, James Loudon, Pat McManus, Isaac Skeeters, and a Mr. Dodd. They had left the main party and were not looking for gold, but having run short of provisions, were seeking wherewithal to stay the gnawing sensations that had seized upon their stomachs. For a time hunger forsook them, as they stood in silent amazement upon the cliffs and drank in awe of the scene stretched before them. After partaking of the inspiration fostered by such weird grandeur, they decided to call it Mysterious, or Deep Blue Lake. It was subsequently called Lake Majesty, and by being constantly referred to as a crater lake, it gradually assumed that name, which is within itself so descriptive. At times when gazing from the surrounding wall, the skies and cliffs are seen perfectly mirrored in the smooth and glassy surface, over which the mountain breeze creates scarce a ripple, and it is with great difficulty the eye can distinguish the line dividing the cliffs from their reflected counterfeits. The lake is almost egg-shaped, ranging northeast by southwest, and is 7 miles long by 6 in width. The water's surface is 6,251 feet above sea level, and is completely surrounded by cliffs, or walls, from 1,000 to over 2,000 feet high, which are scantily covered with coniferous trees. To the southwest is Wizard Island, 845 feet high, circular in shape, and slightly covered with timber. In the top is a depression, or crater, the Witch's Cauldron, 100 feet deep and 475 feet in diameter. This was evidently the last smoking chimney of a once mighty volcano. The base of the island is covered with very heavy and hard rocks, with sharp and unworn edges, over which scarcely a score of human feet have trod. Farther up are deep beds of ashes, and light spongy rocks and cinders, giving evidence of intense heat. Within the crater, as without, the surface is entirely covered with volcanic rocks, but here it forms one of the hottest places, on a clear day in August, it has ever been my lot to witness. Not a breath of air seems to enter, and the hot sun pours down upon thousands of rocks and stones that reflect his rays with an intensity that seems to multiply beyond conception. Here, however, we determined to lunch, and did, but one such experience will last a long time. Directly north of the island is Leo Rock, a grand old sentinel, standing boldly out on the west side of the lake and reaching up over 2,000 feet perpendicular. From the top of it you can drop a stone and it will pass down and grow smaller and smaller, until your head begins to swim and you see the stone become a mere speck, and fade entirely from view, and at last, nearly half a mile below, it strikes the unruffled surface of the water and sinks forever from sight in the depth of a bottomless lake. There is probably no point of interest in America that so completely overcomes the ordinary Indian with fear as Crater Lake. From time immemorial no power has been strong enough to induce him to approach within sight of it. For a paltry sum he will engage to guide you thither, but before you reach the mountain top he will leave you to proceed alone. To the savage mind it is clothed with a deep veil of mystery, and is the abode of all manner of demons and unshapely monsters. Once inhabited by the Great Spirit, it has now become the Sheol of modern times, and it is certain death for any proud savage to behold it. This feeling has, to a certain extent, instilled itself in the mind of such whites as have made it their Mecca, until every stray log that floats upon the water is imagined to possess life, and may possibly be a monster. Exaggerated accounts of different points have been given and implicitly believed without a question of reflection. It has been claimed that the crater was 800 feet deep, while by actual measurement we found it to be scarcely 100. The island was said to be 1,500 feet high, but an accurate measurement placed it at just 845 feet. From Allen Davy, chief of the Klamath tribe, I gleaned the following in reference to the discovery of Crater Lake. "A long time ago, long before the white man appeared in this region to vex and drive the proud native out, a band of Klamaths, while out hunting, came suddenly upon the lake, and were startled by its remarkable walls and awed by its majestic proportions. With spirits subdued and trembling with fear, they silently approached and gazed upon its face. Something within told them the Great Spirit dwelt there, and they dared not remain, but passed silently down the side of the mountain and camped far away. By some unaccountable influence, however, one brave was induced to return. He went up to the very brink of the precipice and started his camp fire. Here he lay down to rest. Here he slept till morn, slept till the sun was high in air, then arose and joined his tribe far down the mountain. At night he came again. Again he slept till morn. Each visit bore a charm that drew him back again. Each night found him sleeping above the rocks. Each night strange voices arose from the waters. Mysterious noises filled the air. At last, after a great many moons, he climbed down to the lake, and there he bathed and spent the night. Often he climbed down in like manner, and frequently saw wonderful animals, similar in all respects to a Klamath Indian, except that they seemed to exist entirely in the water. He suddenly became hardier and stronger than any Indian of his tribe, because of his many visits to the mysterious waters. Others then began to seek its influence. Old warriors sent their sons for strength and courage to meet the conflicts awaiting them. First they slept on the rocks above, then ventured to the water's edge. But last of all they plunged beneath the flood, and the coveted strength was theirs. On one occasion the brave who first visited the lake killed a monster, or fish, and was at once set upon by untold members of excited Laos, for such they were called, who carried him to the top of the cliffs, cut his throat with a stone knife, then tore his body in small pieces, which were thrown down to the waters far beneath, where he was devoured by the angry Laos. And such shall be the fate of every Klamath brave who, from that day to this, dares to look upon the lake." My first visit to Crater Lake was in 1885, at which time the thought was suggested by Captain C. E. Dutton of having the lake and environs drawn from the market. Promptly acting on the suggestion, my friend, the Honourable Binger Herman, was sought and a movement started looking for the formation of a national park. In response to a petition forwarded to Washington and ably advocated by Congressman Herman, the United States Geological Society, under Captain Dutton, was ordered to examine the lake and surroundings during the summer of 1886. In this expedition it was my good fortune to have charge of the sounding, which afforded me a pleasure unsurpassed in all my mountain experience. That an idea may be had of the difficulties to be overcome, suffice it to say, boats had to be built for the purpose in Portland, transported to Ashland, 341 miles by rail, and carried from there to the lake on wagons, 100 miles into the mountains, where they were launched over cliffs 1,000 feet high. On the first day of July I boarded the train for Ashland, where I met Captain Dutton, and we were joined immediately afterwards by Captain George W. Davis, one of the most eminent engineers of America, and 10 soldiers. On the 7th we started for the lake, preceded by Captains Dutton and Davis, who were followed by a 4-mule team bearing a first-class lap streak boat, which in turn was followed by 3 double teams, horsemen and pack-train. Of our largest boat, the Cleetwood, we all felt justly proud, as it was certainly a beautiful model, 4-oared, 26 feet long, and competent to ride almost any sea. When passing through Phoenix, the typical and irrepressible critic came to the surface in the shape of a lean, lank, awkward, ignorant country boy of, say, 18 summers. With hands in his pockets he aided the single suspender delegated to hold his breeches in place, and when shifting a monstrous chew of tobacco over his tongue, informed his audience, of half a dozen small urchins, that "that 'ere boat won't live in Crater Lake 'alf an hour if the storm comes up. It ain't shaped right. Just see for yourself how swayed back it is. It must have been made by some feller as never seen a boat afore." This brings to mind the fact that a critic is a person who finds fault with something of which he is densely ignorant. The entire distance from Ashland, 97 miles, was accomplished by slow, easy marches, every precaution being taken to provide against a mishap, and no incident occurred of special importance. Soon after reaching the foothills we encountered sliding places and short turns in the road. As the waggon containing the Cleetwood was top-heavy and coupled 20 feet long, it was impossible to turn on an ordinary curve, hence it became necessary at times to drive as far as possible, then let 10 or 15 men lift the hind end of the waggon around by main strength. When a sliding place was reached, the men would hang on the upper side or attach ropes to the top and hold it, thus preventing an upset. On Tuesday we succeeded in reaching the foot of the last grade, and on Wednesday morning began the ascent. Here was the rub. The hill is about 1.5 miles long, very steep, sliding, rocky, and filled with roots and stones, added to which were great banks of snow, packed solid by constant thawing. Progress was slow and tedious, a roadway having to be cut in places, while men with picks, axes, and shovels dug up rocks, cut down trees, and shovelled snow, besides building up or cutting down one side of the roadway. At 10 o'clock on Wednesday the 14th the boats were landed on the walls of the lake, having travelled 440 miles from Portland, with scarcely a scratch to mar the paint. Thursday morning the work of launching was commenced by covering the bottom of each skiff with inch boards, firmly secured, as also a shield in front of the bow. They were carried to the lowest place to be found in the cliffs, probably about 900 feet, vertical measurement, where a canyon descends at an angle of 35 or 40 degrees, when a 3/4 inch rope was attached and in turn passed around a tree on the summit, where a man was stationed to manage it, directed by signals below. One was lowered at a time, accompanied by 4 men to guide and handle it. Besides this, men were stationed at different points to signal to stop, and thus regulate the paying out of rope. Every effort was made to send all loose stones on ahead, to prevent accident from above, yet before the first boat had proceeded 300 feet in its descent, a boulder came rolling from nearly the summit with increasing velocity, and before anyone realized the danger, had struck a rock in near proximity and bounded over the skiff, passed between the men and within an inch of one fellow's head. Before the descent was completed, the boards were torn from the first boat, but extra precaution was taken with the second one. About 2/3 of the way down, a perfect shower of rocks came tumbling from a cliff to the left, but, strange as it may seem, they either bounded over or around the men and boat, so that no damage resulted. At 3 o'clock the first skiff reached bottom somewhat scratched, but not injured in any manner. The second one was placed in the lake entirely uninjured at 6 o'clock p.m. Our tents were pitched in a beautiful spot. In the immediate foreground to the north lies the lake with its 20-odd miles of rugged cliffs standing abruptly from the water's edge. To the left is Wizard Island, on the top of which rests the Witch's Cauldron, or crater, like a great flat top. Beyond stands Llao Rock, solemn, grim, and grand, over 2,000 feet perpendicular, while still beyond stands Mount Thielson, the lightning rod of the Cascades. Just to the east of the lake is Mount Scott, partly covered with snow, while close to the camp on the east is a high cliff known as Cathedral Rock, running far down to the right and at last disappearing below the tree-tops. To the south the scene was varied by a wide range of mountain tops stretching far away to California, chief among which is snow-capped and beautiful Pitt. Just to the left the rough mountain view is changed to a charming plain, in the midst of which is a broad expanse of water which proves to be Klamath Lake, about 30 miles distant. Thursday evening dark and threatening clouds were suddenly seen to approach from this point, accompanied by vivid flashes of lightning and loud peals of thunder. A few large drops of rain had fallen, when there was a sudden outburst of joy in camp, as everyone glanced at the sides of Cathedral Rock, which were suddenly illuminated by a light of deep orange. To the west the sun was slowly sinking to rest, when a glowing light spread itself over the dark clouds, which became brighter and still brighter. Looking beyond, a scene of unparalleled magnificence was spread before us. Through the centre hung long fleecy clouds, lighted to a deep orange, while above, like a great curtain, was spread a belt of olive green. Here and there were tints of crimson, the delicacy of which no artist could approach. Above and parallel with the horizon stretched a long rift, in clouds rendered marvellously rich in gold and garnet, through which the blue sky beyond was visible, slightly obscured by light, fleecy clouds of silver. During all this magnificent sight, the electric storm raged in the south with unabated fury. Flashes of lightning and peals of thunder added solemnity to a scene of wonderful brilliance. The 16th was spent in preparing the Fleetwood for her final plunge over the cliffs in search of water. The sled was made of very heavy timbers, on which she was placed, keel up, then lashed and braced in every conceivable manner until, in fact, she seemed a part of the sled itself. Guy ropes were placed on each corner to guide it, in connection with a heavy handspike. Saturday morning the actual work of launching began, by sliding the boat over a snowdrift in a canyon that slopes to the lake at about an angle of 50 degrees. The cliff is probably 1,000 feet high at this point. The sled was attached by block and tackle to a tree on the summit and lowered nearly half-way, when the bearing was shifted as far down as possible and a new start taken. Leaving the summit at 7:30 a.m., it required the most persistent work and constant care of 15 men, 8 hours, to reach the lake. In the bottom of the canyon flows a stream of water that contributes very materially to the danger of such an undertaking, as constant slides of rock are thus caused. When the bottom seemed to be reached, it was found that there still remained a sort of jump off or slide into the water, perpendicular and about 15 feet high. The water at this point is very deep, and the question arose, how shall we launch the boat now that we have got it here? It was simply turned right side up again, lashed to the sled, and let partially down with the bow thrown out as far as possible. It was held securely in this position while one of the men climbed aboard, cut the lines, and she shot forward in fine style, not shipping a gallon of water, although the bow was almost submerged to start with. The moment the launching was complete there was a cry of unrestrained joy sent up from all present, and our shouts were answered from the cliffs by waving of hats and blowing of foghorns. With one impulse the cry was raised, "Now for the island!" and in an incredibly short space of time both skiffs and the Fleetwood were headed that way. With 4 men at the oars we soon reached our destination, and then returned to camp, where a bountiful repast awaited us. Every precaution was taken to clear the canyon of loose rocks; nevertheless a few rolled down, but were successfully dodged until the boat was actually in the water, immediately after which a small boulder came down with terrific force. Captain Davis stood directly in its course, and not seeing it, the other members of the party shouted to him to look out. It being impossible for him to run, he jumped under the framework or sled, hanging where the boat left it, and laid flat on the ground, just as the stone struck a rock and the upper end of the frame. It then struck Captain Davis in the back, but its force had been so broken that it did no harm further than to make the spot feel sore. The day after launching the Fleetwood 9 members of our party made the circuit of the lake in a sort of casual observation or tour of inspection. The scenery was grand to a degree far beyond our most sanguine expectations. 4 strong oarsmen soon brought us to Llao Rock, and as we gazed in silent wonder at its rugged sides, reaching nearly half a mile above us, for the first time did we realize the immensity of such a spectacle. Never before did I fully understand the meaning of figures when they run up into the thousands of feet, vertical measurement. Beyond Llao Rock we found a beautiful little bay, and beyond it a larger one, probably 1 mile long by a quarter of a mile deep. Here we stopped for lunch, and when landing were surprised to find a long line of dead moths, of large variety, washed up by the waves and in such numbers that the air was laden with an unpleasant odour, apparently about a first cousin to a slaughter-house. We also found here a narrow beach of small gravel, running almost the entire length of the bay, while further out in the lake the bottom is composed of sand. As this point had not only never been named, but probably was never before visited by human beings, we decided to christen it Fleetwood Cove. Passing on our journey, it was soon seen that the cliffs on the north side are not so high as those to the south. In several places it appeared that good trails could easily be made to the water's edge, over which a person might almost ride horseback, and in one place, without any grading whatever, a good pack train could descend with comparative ease. About 2 o'clock a thunder shower came suddenly upon us just as 2 beautiful grottos appeared in view. Into one of these the boat was run, where we were entirely beyond the reach of rain. It proved to be about 30 feet deep and 20 wide, and an arched roof probably 8 feet above the water, while the rocky bottom could be distinctly seen 10 feet below the surface. So perfect was its form that it almost seemed the hand of man had hewn it from the solid rock. Beyond it towered an immense cliff, very high, with broken rugged sides, picturesque and sublime, which I insist on naming Dutton Cliff, in honour of Captain Dutton, who has done and is doing so much to make Crater Lake justly famous. This point may be known from the fact that it lies directly opposite Llao Rock, and between the 2 lowest places in the lake's walls. Immediately north of Dutton Cliff the elements have worn the sides of the mountain, leaving a harder substance, alternately coloured red and yellow, resembling the mansard roof of a cottage, while in one place tall red chimneys stand aloft, making, all in all, such a scene that Cottage Rock could scarcely be improved on for a name. Lying between the 2 points above referred to, a break in the wall was found that is almost perpendicular, but certainly does not exceed 500 feet in height. This is by far the lowest point in the walls. No time was lost in getting our surroundings under way. The first was made about 100 yards from shore. It was supposed that we might possibly find as much as 100 feet of water, but as the lead ran out, our excitement grew with each succeeding 100 feet, until over 1,200 feet were out. At 1,200 feet the machine stopped, and our pent-up feelings exploded into one wild yell of delight. For a number of days the soundings were continued. The greatest depth recorded was 1,996 feet, which, making allowance for stretch of wire, would give 2,008 feet. Of the whole number made, 18 are over 1,900, 13 over 1,800, 11 over 1,700, 15 over 1,600, and 19 over 1,500. It was found that at the bottom of the northeastern end lies a plain of several square miles, almost perfectly level, while south of the centre is a cliff about 900 feet high, and west of the centre seems to be Cinder Cone, nearly 1,200 feet in height, with a crater in the centre 250 feet deep. Its summit is 600 feet below the surface of the water. On one occasion our party took 5 pounds of red fire, which we intended to burn on the summit of Wizard Island, but owing to the fact that the air was so filled with smoke as to destroy the effect, our plan was changed, and we took it to Rogue River Falls on our return. Here we met quite a number of hardy mountaineers, and at 9 o'clock left camp for the falls, about 1 mile distant. The night was very dark, and a weird sort of scene it was, as we climbed over logs and rocks, lighting our way by tallow candles and a lantern that flickered dimly. At last the bank of the stream was reached, and while the noise of the rushing waters was intense, nothing could be seen but the dim outline of something white far down below us. At this point the walls are perpendicular and 180 feet high. They are also solid rock from top to bottom. Directly opposite where we stood, Mill Creek falls into Rogue River, 180 feet. And this is what we came to see. In order to get the benefit of the red light, it was necessary for someone to climb down to the water. This duty fell to a stranger in the party, who made the descent during the day, and myself. He led the way carrying a dim lantern, and I followed as best I could. The rocks are covered with a remarkably thick layer of moss, which is kept very wet by the rising mist. The path, if such it might be termed, led along the sides of the cliff at an angle of about 45 degrees. As we cautiously climbed from rock to rock, it was a sort of feeling of intensified interest that overcame us, when we realized that a single misstep would precipitate us to the rocks below, and, worst of all, possibly we never would be missed. The bed of the stream was reached at last, and the fire ignited close to the falls. Ye gods, what a transformation! Suddenly the cañon, which could not be seen before, was as bright as day, lighted by a fire so brilliant that we could not look upon it. Crimson air and crimson water, crimson walls and crimson everywhere. No magician of the Arabians ever conjured up by a stroke of his wand a spectacle more sublime. It was one of transcendent beauty, upon which the human eye seldom rests, and when it does its possessor is spellbound by the bewildering vision. One almost loses the power of speech in the desperate struggle to see and comprehend the scene, and before it is realized the light dies away and darkness reigns supreme, rendered tenfold more dense by the splendour of so magnificent a tableau. Near the base of Dutton Cliff stands a solitary rock, probably 100 feet high by 200 in length and nearly the same breadth, that, while not seen by the present generation of Indians, is nevertheless known to them, and is a special object of superstitious dread. They consider it as a peculiarly ferocious monster, but are unable to describe its characteristics. It stands in the lake entirely alone and about 50 yards from shore. Standing on the cliffs 5 miles to the west and looking across the lake, this strange rock is plainly visible in the sunlight, its rugged peaks reaching aloft, giving it the appearance of a full-rigged ship at anchor. Should a cloud pass before the sun as the shadow strikes the rock, it will pass from view as effectually as though it had ceased to exist. While sounding the lake in 1886, I caused a party of topographical engineers to be landed here for observations, but it was so rugged that the most diligent search failed to reveal a level place large enough to accommodate the tripod attached to their instruments, and we were compelled to resort to a point on shore for the purpose. I have never learned its Indian name, but among the whites it is known as the Phantom Ship. To those who enjoy the noble sport of hunting, the vicinity of Crater Lake is especially attractive. Great numbers of deer, bear, and panther roam through the timber in fancied security, inviting the keen eye and steady nerve of the sportsman. Although passionately fond of such sport myself, the grandeur and sublimity of the surroundings so overcame me with desire to see and prosecute our explorations, that I forgot my love for a running shot in an inordinate desire to climb over the cliffs and view the wonderful place from every conceivable point. My companions were no less affected, and the result was that we ran out of meat and applied to a native sheep herder for mutton chops. He scowled upon us for a moment, then informed our spokesman that when he butchered he never saved the heads. While running a line of soundings from Vlao Rock to Vide Cliff across the lake one day, a strong wind sprung up from the south, accompanied by black clouds, and a storm seemed imminent. We had proceeded about 3 miles across when we were suddenly startled by a loud noise, as though a multitude of men were savagely beating tin pans. In a very few minutes the southwestern cliffs became white, and we could plainly see the colour line advancing to the north, until all the cliffs to the west seemed covered with snow. To add to so strange a sight, a good-sized waterfall began pouring over Vlao Rock, and falling to the lake 2,000 feet below. Within half an hour from the beginning of the storm the waterfall ceased, the cliffs became dark again, the wind shifted to the northwest and drove millions of hailstones upon us, sufficiently large to make us wince when struck, especially when struck all over with no possible means of escape. The only accident to any of our party during the sojourn befell a highly respected mule attached to the Topographical Engineer Corps. One day, as the party passed along the east side of Dutton Cliff, progress seemed almost blocked by high precipices. A point was found overlooking a yawning chasm, where a large tree had fallen and lodged. By throwing in stones and brush, a sort of trail was made to terra firma beyond the backbone of the mountain. Over this the pack train was passed safely, except a mule that was blind in one eye. He bore a reputation for dignity and sobriety that many well-to-do mule might envy. However, when just at the point which, above all others, should have received his undivided attention, he became gay and festive, and as a consequence fell part way over the precipice. By dint of hard labour he was drawn back, but little the worse for wear. His pack was removed, and he again started across. Again, however, he became frisky, and pitched headlong over a rocky precipice 500 feet high. As his limbs mixed with those of the trees below, the thoughts of the spectators above were, "There goes all that is mortal of Croppy, who climbed to the top of Mount Shasta, but died in a lonely canyon, by his own hand, in a fit of temporary insanity. Let him R.I.P." One day, while at work on the lake, my attention was called to what seemed to be a tall, full-bearded man standing on the southern portion of Vlao Rock's summit. One foot was placed a little forward of the other, and the knee bent slightly, but naturally, while before him stood a gun. His hands were clasped over the muzzle as he gazed intently to the north. Just behind him stood a boy apparently about 15 years of age. They seemed entirely too natural not to be flesh and blood, and yet persons at that distance would not be visible to the naked eye, as we were 2 miles out on the lake. Day after day, as our work progressed, their position remained the same, and, in the absence of a better explanation, we decided them to be trees. Crater Lake is but a striking memento of a dread past. Imagine a vast mountain 6 by 7 miles through, at an elevation of 8,000 feet, with the top removed and the inside hollowed out, then filled with the clearest water in the world to within 2,000 feet of the top, then place a round island in one end 845 feet high, then dig a circular hole tapering to the centre, like a funnel 100 feet deep and 475 feet in diameter, and you will have a perfect representation of Crater Lake. It is hard to comprehend what an immense affair it is. To those living in New York City, I would say, Crater Lake is large enough to have Manhattan, Randall's, Ward's, and Blackwell's islands dropped into it, side by side, without touching the walls, or Chicago or Washington City might do the same. Our own fair city of Portland, with all her suburbs, from the City Park to Mount Tabor, from Albina to Selwood inclusive, could find ample room on the bottom of the lake. On the other hand, if it were possible to place the lake at its present elevation above either of these cities, it would be over a mile to the surface of the water, and 1 3/4 miles to the top of Leo Rock. Of this distance the ascent would be through water for 2,000 feet. To those living in New Hampshire, it might be said, the surface of the water is 23 feet higher than the summit of Mount Washington. What an immense affair it must have been ages upon ages ago, when, long before the hot breath of a volcano soiled its hoary head, standing as a proud monarch, with its feet upon earth and its head in the heavens, it towered far, far above the mountain ranges, looked far down upon the snowy peaks of Hood and Shasta, and snuffed the air beyond the reach of Everest. Then streams of fire began to shoot forth, great seas of lava were hurled beyond the earth beneath. The elements seemed bent upon establishing hell upon earth and fixing its throne upon this great mountain. At last its foundation gave way, and it sank forever from sight. Down, 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 deep into the bowels of the earth, leaving a great, black, smoking chasm, which succeeding ages filled with pure, fresh water, giving to our day and generation one of the most beautiful lakes within the vision of man. In conclusion, I will say, Crater Lake is one of the grandest points of interest on earth. Here all the ingenuity of nature seems to have been exerted to the fullest capacity to build one grand, awe-inspiring temple, within which to live and from which to gaze upon the surrounding world and say, "Here would I dwell and live forever. Here would I make my home from choice. The universe is my kingdom, and this my throne." End of Crater Lake, one of the world's great natural wonders.